Today I'm going to share the story of Elizabeth Holmes, who went from being described by Forbes magazine as the youngest and wealthiest self-made entrepreneur in America to becoming one of the most notorious fraudsters of recent times. Today we will examine the rise and fall of Elizabeth Holmes and her company, Theranos. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on February 3rd, 1984, in Washington, D.C., to parents Christian and Noel Holmes. From childhood, Elizabeth showed an extraordinary level of ambition. At only 7 years old, she drafted detailed plans for a time machine, filling pages with technical diagrams and descriptions of how it might work. At 9, when asked the question most children hear, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" she confidently replied, "I want to be a billionaire." When someone suggested she could instead become President of the United States, she instantly rejected the idea, saying, "Absolutely not. The President will marry me because I'll be a billionaire." One event deeply shaped Elizabeth's childhood and, ultimately, her life: the death of her uncle. She was extremely close to him, had grown up with him, and loved him deeply. But one day he was diagnosed with skin cancer, which quickly spread to his bones and eventually his brain. And not long after, he died. According to Elizabeth, this loss triggered a cascade of thoughts in her mind. Questions like why doctors were unable to help him and why there wasn't enough time to save him. As I'll explain later, this was the moment when her desire began to form. The dream of transforming the healthcare system and improving the way diseases are diagnosed. Her parents always supported her determined and confident personality, and they constantly held high expectations for her future. On the other hand, success seemed almost hereditary in her family. On her father's side, Elizabeth descended from Louis Charles Fleischmann, founder of an enormously prosperous company that had turned the family into one of the most influential in America at the time. Fleischmann's daughter Betty later married a Danish physician, Dr. Christian Holmes, who became Elizabeth's great-grandfather, or perhaps great-great-grandfather. Using his wife's powerful social connections, he went on to establish the Cincinnati General Hospital, as well as the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. On her mother's side, Elizabeth's grandfather graduated from West Point and pursued a prestigious military career, eventually becoming a high-ranking officer at the Pentagon in 1970. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by stories about her family's accomplishments, constantly hearing about ambition, achievement, and legacy. It is no surprise that she developed a forceful personality, determined, unyielding, and above all, fiercely competitive. Elizabeth hated losing. According to her family, she never learned how to accept defeat. Even as a child, during family afternoons playing Monopoly, the rare times she lost a game, she would stand up from the table in anger, cause a dramatic scene, and storm out of the room, slamming the door behind her. In high school, Elizabeth spent most of her time studying. She didn't have many friends, and she didn't care about popularity. Books were her closest companions. She often studied late into the night, pushing herself harder than anyone else, quickly becoming a model student. So when the moment arrived to choose a university, she had no doubts. Stanford. Elizabeth dreamed of becoming a great entrepreneur, and Stanford was the ideal environment to achieve that goal. Yahoo had been founded there, and the creators of Google had emerged from its halls. She believed she belonged in that world of innovation. But of course, entering such a prestigious university was not easy. Throughout high school, Elizabeth made a firm decision. She would do whatever it took to succeed. She eventually persuaded Stanford professors to admit her into their summer Mandarin program in China, even though it was typically open only to college students. Thanks to her determination and persuasive nature, she was accepted. Her father had traveled to China many times for work, so he had his children learn Mandarin from a young age. As a result, Elizabeth spoke it fluently and impressed the head of Stanford's Mandarin program, so much that, combined with her excellent academic results, she was admitted to Stanford University in the spring of 2002, choosing chemical engineering as her major. But after only a few months, she had already begun considering dropping out. During Christmas dinner that year, her father jokingly wrote PhD on a piece of paper, folded it into a small airplane, and tossed it to her across the table. Elizabeth opened it and told him her decision. "No, Dad, I'm not interested in getting a PhD at Stanford. Actually, I'm thinking about leaving Stanford. I want to start making money. I want to get rich. I want to invent something that will change the world." She believed it so strongly that a few months later she showed up at her boyfriend's door, ended their relationship, and told him she had to devote herself entirely to her future as a great entrepreneur, despite not even knowing yet what her inventions would be. Elizabeth officially left Stanford in the fall of 2003, but before withdrawing, she spent the summer working in a medical laboratory in Singapore. Asia had just been struck by the SARS epidemic, and she spent those months analyzing blood samples and swabs from infected and non-infected patients. During her time in that laboratory, Elizabeth spent the entire summer examining blood samples and swabs from both infected and healthy patients. As she handled tube after tube, loading them into the centrifuge and repeating every long, delicate step of the testing process, she grew increasingly frustrated. The procedure was slow, repetitive, and incredibly tedious. There had to be, she thought, a simpler and faster way to run blood tests. And in that moment, like a light switching on in her mind, she believed she had found it. The brilliant idea that would finally make her rich and famous, the invention that would let her change the world. She went to her lab supervisor and shared her thoughts. Processing and analyzing blood samples required too much work, she said, not to mention how they were collected. Needles were painful. Patients feared them. Drawing vials of blood from people's arms was invasive and inefficient. Surely, she insisted, there must be a faster and more effective alternative. Her supervisor listened, unimpressed, and simply shook his head. "No," he answered. "There was no other way." Elizabeth didn't appreciate that response. She had expected praise, some recognition that she was different from the others in the lab. She was proactive. She had ideas. But instead of encouragement, she got a flat rejection. Back home after that work trip, she locked herself in front of her computer for 5 straight days, sleeping only 2 hours a night, barely eating, obsessively sketching her invention. Phyllis Gardner, a professor of medicine at Stanford, later recalled how Elizabeth came to her office during that time, bursting with enthusiasm. She pitched her new idea, the TheraPatch. It would be a small patch filled with a special serum and advanced microtechnology, capable of drawing a drop of blood from the skin, analyzing it instantly, and then delivering antibiotics directly into the bloodstream. Professor Gardner listened patiently, then told her, "Elizabeth, I admire your passion. It would be a wonderful idea if it were possible. But it isn't. It's physically impossible." Elizabeth came back a second time, trying to convince her again, but the professor repeated the same answer. "The laws of physics," she said, "don't bend to enthusiasm." But Elizabeth Holmes was not someone who accepted no for an answer. She didn't quit. She didn't retreat. Instead, she found someone who believed in her, Roy Schoeman, a fellow researcher from Stanford. Roy was captivated by her pitch and by the fierce conviction behind it. He believed the TheraPatch could revolutionize not just blood testing, but the entire healthcare industry. Elizabeth had already filed a patent for the idea, and Roy, without hesitation, joined her new startup as a researcher. The company's first name was Real Life Cures, though due to a typo, it once appeared as Real Life Curse, a strangely ironic mistake considering what would unfold in the years to come. The name was soon changed to Theranos, a blend of therapy and diagnosis. Elizabeth chose to base her company where all big ideas were born: Silicon Valley. Located in the southern San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley was and still is the global center of high technology and innovation. Its history goes back to 1939, when two Stanford graduates founded the first electronics company there. Over time, it became the birthplace of the silicon microchip and home to giants like Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, eBay, and Twitter. For Elizabeth, no other place in the world made sense for her company. But opening a startup required office space, employees, and above all, money. So she did what every ambitious entrepreneur does when they have a bold idea. She went searching for investors. She and Roy arranged a meeting with Annette Campbell-White, one of the most powerful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. Venture capitalists invest private money in young startups in exchange for equity, gambling on ideas with massive potential. Annette was known for backing visionary founders, and Elizabeth was determined to impress her. She delivered her pitch with complete confidence, explaining that she suffered from a fear of needles, something she said she inherited from her mother. Millions of people, she told Annette, avoided blood tests because they feared pain. Her invention, she claimed, would change everything. But when she presented the concept of the TheraPatch, Annette wasn't convinced. She was impressed by Elizabeth's confidence, especially considering she was only 19. But the idea sounded unrealistic, nearly impossible. So Annette asked the obvious question: "Can you explain the technology behind it?" "How exactly does it work?" Elizabeth immediately stiffened. Offended, she stood up and replied that perhaps Annette simply wasn't the right kind of visionary for such an innovative product. And she walked out. She was sure Annette would be perfect for her company. Instead, clearly, Annette hadn't thought broadly enough. Just like when she was a child and lost at Monopoly, she stormed out of the office in a fury, slamming the door behind her. After that meeting, Elizabeth concluded that if her idea was to succeed, she needed different backers, more innovative, younger investors, not people like Annette, who, in her view, were old-fashioned and too narrow to grasp her supposed genius. How many brilliant people were rejected before achieving immense success? Walt Disney, for instance, was fired early in his career because his boss claimed he lacked creativity and good ideas. Steve Jobs was long dismissed as crazy, told for years he would never amount to anything. Even the great Thomas Edison, the inventor of everything, was allegedly called stupid by his own teachers. Elizabeth placed herself among them, a misunderstood genius. She drew inspiration from the last two names, Steve Jobs and Thomas Edison, to build what she believed would become her empire. And indeed, just 1 year later, by late 2004, her company Theranos had raised more than $6 million. Elizabeth opened a large office in Silicon Valley, hired staff, built a laboratory. She had done it. Over time, however, they realized the patch, the TheraPatch, couldn't actually work. She abandoned that concept and pivoted to a new idea. She was bursting with concepts, and this next one felt revolutionary. Edison. It resembled the small devices diabetics use to measure blood sugar by pricking a finger. But Elizabeth's machine, she said, would go far beyond glucose. It would return virtually any blood value from a single fingerstick drop. You heard that right. Elizabeth claimed to have invented a system that could analyze a person's blood using only a tiny sample. Incredible, isn't it? And the name, Edison, ring any bells? To me, the irony in this story is thickest here. She named the machine after Thomas Edison, the figure who inspired so much of her persona. In interviews, she often quoted him, especially lines like, "I didn't fail even once. I only found 10,000 ways to show something doesn't work, so I'm 10,000 steps closer to the solution." This was a quote Elizabeth repeated constantly, and there was another line from Edison she loved to use. "Our greatest weakness lies in giving up." The surest way to succeed is always to try just one more time. But before going any further, let me tell you something about Thomas Edison that many people already know. There's even an episode of The Simpsons about it. We are taught in school, at least I was, that Edison was the brilliant inventor behind 4 of the most important creations in human history: the telegraph, the phonograph, the light bulb, and the motion picture camera. A genius beyond comparison, right? How could one man alone come up with so many revolutionary inventions that changed the world? Well, the truth is, he didn't. Yes, legally his name appears on the patents for those inventions, but in reality, he didn't actually invent them all. There's a saying in English, "Fake it until you make it." It means pretend to be something long enough, and eventually you will become it. Thomas Edison practically invented that philosophy, one that, not coincidentally, became a core motto of Silicon Valley. If you want to be a successful entrepreneur, act like one before you are one. Dress the part, speak like a visionary. Even if you're broke and still hunting for investors, pretend hard enough, lie convincingly enough, and eventually people will believe you. And once they believe you, you'll start believing yourself. Back to Edison. Here's a quick example. His story is long and complex and deserves its own discussion. But let's focus on his most famous invention. The light bulb. The light bulb was not invented by Edison. It was first created by 2 men, Woodward and Evans. They had built an early prototype, crude, but functional. However, they hadn't patented it and didn't have the financial means to perfect it. At the same time, a British scientist named Joseph Swan was also developing a similar lamp. Edison recognized the enormous potential and rushed to patent the idea under his own name, essentially stealing it from its true creators. Later, he hired an entire team of researchers to refine and commercialize it. They worked for years improving the bulb until it became viable. History, however, remembers only one name: Thomas Edison. But Edison wasn't truly a brilliant inventor. He was a brilliant businessman with an unmatched instinct for opportunity. Let's return to Elizabeth Holmes and her invention, Edison. Earlier, I mentioned the irony behind the name, and here's why. This ingenious machine never actually worked, but Elizabeth was not only ambitious, she was also a skilled businesswoman. She knew how to speak, how to persuade, and how to build belief. She managed to convince people that Edison functioned perfectly and would soon revolutionize the world. One of the first people she persuaded was Channing Robertson, a respected professor of chemical engineering at Stanford and one of her former instructors. Robertson believed in her so completely that he resigned from his prestigious position at Stanford to join Theranos and work alongside her. But how was this revolutionary device supposed to work? According to Elizabeth, Edison would take a single, tiny drop of blood from a patient's fingertip. That drop would be placed into a miniature capsule called a nanotainer, which would then be inserted into the machine, and then, like magic, the device would instantly produce results for virtually any blood test imaginable. This, she claimed, would change everything. Blood tests were painful, expensive, and often inaccessible. Many people avoided them altogether. Some feared needles, others didn't want to face their results, and many simply couldn't afford repeated lab work. Elizabeth promised that Edison would eliminate all those barriers. Quick, affordable diagnosis from home, with just a drop of blood, saving lives through early detection. In interviews, she often brought up her uncle's death, insisting she had devoted her life to preventing others from suffering like she did. Her mission, she said, was to help people, to do good. But as I mentioned, there was one small issue. Edison did not work. The first major problem was the blood sample itself. There simply wasn't enough blood in a single drop to run multiple tests accurately. But Elizabeth refused to listen. It had to be one drop, nothing more. The second problem was the device's size. It was too small to hold all the components needed to perform complex analysis. Again, she ignored every objection. The machine had to be portable, she insisted. No compromises. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and her team hid the truth and kept raising money. By 2010, Theranos had secured more than $90 million in investments. Among the early backers was Tim Draper, the first investor in Hotmail, Skype, Tesla, Twitter, Twitch, and many other massive companies. He wasn't some amateur. He was a legendary Silicon Valley investor, known for spotting the future. And he believed in Elizabeth Holmes. Another major investor in Theranos was Rupert Murdoch, the media billionaire, along with the Walton family, founders of the Walmart supermarket empire. The company's board of directors also included powerful and influential figures such as George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of State, and Henry Kissinger, another former U.S. Secretary of State. Elizabeth's rise was unstoppable. She appeared on the covers of Forbes and Fortune, celebrated as Woman of the Year, hailed as a visionary, a Silicon Valley prodigy. And now you might be wondering, if her little machine didn't even work, how did Theranos manage to grow so quickly? How did the company survive and expand so dramatically? The reason is simple. They kept claiming Edison was still in development, that it just needed a little more time. And the truth is, none of her wealthy investors had the technical or medical knowledge to understand whether the technology was real or not. They saw a young genius, a disruptive idea, a glamorous story, and they threw money at it. Meanwhile, the company kept operating, and real patients began receiving results from Theranos machines, results that were dangerously inaccurate. Some people were told they had severe health problems when they didn't. Others were falsely reassured they were fine, when in reality they were at serious risk. One man even suffered a heart attack after receiving misleading results. When confronted in interviews about the reliability of her technology, Elizabeth dodged responsibility. A journalist once asked, "Based on what we know, is it possible that these results were wrong?" She responded coldly, "I'm not the lab director. What I can tell you is that I've put the best people in place to investigate every aspect of our system to ensure we meet the highest standards of quality." She never admitted anything. She never doubted herself, at least not in public. Elizabeth was incredibly skilled at crafting an illusion. She gave powerful speeches, moved with confidence, and spoke as though she were the greatest innovator of the century. And people believed her. Her transformation was deliberate. She began dressing only in black, always wearing the same outfit: black turtleneck, black trousers. When asked why, she claimed she wanted to eliminate trivial decisions and dedicate 100% of her mental energy to Theranos. Sound familiar? Of course it does. Steve Jobs used to say exactly the same thing, and Elizabeth copied not just his wardrobe, but also his mannerisms, tone, and corporate philosophy. When people pointed that out, she responded defensively, "That's not true. Steve Jobs wore jeans. I wear black pants." There was something else about her that seemed unnatural. Her voice. If you listen to her interviews, you'll notice that she speaks in a very deep tone, much lower than most women. Many people who worked with her claimed that this was completely fake, that she forced herself to speak in a low register because a deeper voice sounds more authoritative in Silicon Valley. And authority was exactly what she needed people to believe she had. But a carefully crafted image can only survive as long as no one dares to question it. And eventually, someone did. Inside Theranos, the pressure was suffocating. Employees were leaving one after another, frustrated and alarmed by what they saw behind the glossy facade. Many tried to raise concerns internally, but were silenced by strict non-disclosure agreements and threats from Theranos lawyers. Elizabeth had turned the company into a fortress of secrecy. No department knew what the others were doing. Scientists were forbidden to speak to each other. The truth had to remain hidden. Then came Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Shultz. Yes, the same former U.S. Secretary of State who sat on the Theranos board. Tyler was a young employee at the company and one of the first insiders to realize the truth. Theranos was lying, and patients' lives were being put at risk. When he tried to speak up, Elizabeth and her partner, Sunny Balwani, Theranos' president and COO, attempted to intimidate him into silence. They hired private investigators to follow him and lawyers to threaten him. They even pressured his own grandfather to turn against him. But Tyler did something no one else had dared to do. He became a whistleblower. And he wasn't alone. Other former employees, including Erica Chung, began sharing what they knew with a journalist from the Wall Street Journal, John Carreyrou. He wasn't fooled by Silicon Valley hype. He didn't care about TED Talks or magazine covers. He cared about facts. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published a bombshell investigation exposing Theranos. The article revealed that the company was not using its Edison machines for most tests at all. Instead, it secretly ran samples using modified commercial lab devices. Worse, the results were often wrong. Very wrong. The illusion had shattered. Elizabeth Holmes immediately went on television to defend herself. She called the article false, claimed it was written by a sexist journalist, and insisted that Theranos technology was real. But the truth had already begun to surface, and it was unstoppable. After the Wall Street Journal expose, everything began to collapse, slowly at first. And then, all at once, regulatory agencies, investors, and business partners started asking questions that Elizabeth could no longer avoid. In 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, conducted an inspection of the Theranos labs. The results were devastating. The laboratories were unsafe, the testing process unreliable, and the company's internal data manipulated to hide failures. CMS revoked Theranos' license to operate blood testing labs. From that moment, it was over. No more patients, no more contracts, no more credibility. Walgreens, one of Theranos' biggest partners, terminated its collaboration and sued the company for hundreds of millions of dollars. Investors realized they had been deceived. The once celebrated startup, valued at $9 billion, vanished overnight. Still, Elizabeth Holmes tried to hold on to her empire. She continued to appear calm in interviews, speaking in her deep, controlled voice, insisting that the company was working with regulators and that the vision remains the same. But everyone around her could see it. The mask was cracking. By 2018, Theranos was officially shut down. That same year, Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani were indicted for massive fraud, charged with deceiving investors, doctors, and patients about the accuracy and capabilities of their blood testing technology. They had raised over $700 million on lies. The trial was long, complex, and filled with shocking testimonies from former employees to investors who described how completely they had been manipulated. Prosecutors painted a clear picture. Elizabeth Holmes had built her empire on illusion, driven not by science, but by ambition, ego, and fear of failure. In January 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud. She was later sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Her partner and former COO, Sunny Balwani, received a similar sentence. In 2023, Holmes began serving her time at a federal prison in Texas. And so, one of the most fascinating and disturbing stories in Silicon Valley came to an end. Not with a billion-dollar IPO, not with a Nobel Prize or a global medical revolution, but with a prison sentence. Elizabeth Holmes had promised to change the world. In every interview, she spoke about helping people and democratizing healthcare. She told the world that Edison would save lives, but in the end, her invention didn't save anyone. It put people at risk. Her company didn't disrupt the medical industry. It became one of the biggest frauds in tech history. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is not the lie she built. It's how many people believed it. Billionaires, former U.S. Secretaries of State, professors from Stanford, pharmaceutical executives, journalists, even doctors. They all wanted to believe in the myth of the young genius who would change everything. They didn't ask for evidence. They didn't demand proof. They trusted the story. Theranos was not just a scam. It was a mirror, showing how easily people can be blinded by charisma, by ambition, by the seductive power of a good narrative. Elizabeth Holmes learned early on a dangerous truth. If you look confident enough, speak boldly enough, and never show doubt, people will follow you anywhere, even if you lead them straight into a lie. What remains today are the lessons that science is not built on slogans, that innovation cannot exist without truth, and that no matter how far a lie travels, reality always catches up. Elizabeth Holmes once said, "The moment you give up is the moment you let someone else win." But in the end, she didn't lose because she gave up. She lost because she never told the truth.